So now we're entering into verse 11. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals, and they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. Let's stop right there. The people of Israel, this is that generation from verse 10 that grew up without knowing the Lord, without knowing the work that he had done for Israel, without knowing how he had delivered the Israelites from Egypt, without knowing all the signs and wonders, because they hadn't been taught, they hadn't been told. And so now this generation in verse 11 is the people that we're talking about here. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. It's one thing to do wrong and not know that you've done wrong. And it's another thing to disobey and know that God is watching you, to know that he has said, don't do that, and you do it. There's rebellion in a heart that knows God is watching, that knows that God has given a command, and they haven't done it. Half-hearted obedience is disobedience. God wants wholehearted obedience. And so these people here, they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They knew God was watching, and they served the Baals. Two great evils that we see here are abandoning the Lord and idolatry. Those two things together are going to result in the wrath of God. God just doesn't show his anger just because. God doesn't get angry for no reason. God has withheld his anger for generation after generation. This isn't just a month of time that has gone by. This is generations upon generations of disobedience and blatant sinful behavior against God. We see that they abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. Something to notice is the plural form of Baal. We see it in verse 11 and we see it again in verse 13. The Baals, this is plural. Singular Baal or Baal was a Syrian god of storms and war. But the plural form of Baal or Baal is to mean every god, all gods. And so the people served the Baals, which means they served all the gods. There was a god for storms and a god for war, but there was also a god for rain and sun, and the god for the moon, and the god for the crops, and the god for the harvest, and a god for everything. And these are the gods that they served, all of them. When you see the Baals, it's plural. It's all the gods that they served. And then we see something else, and the Ashtaroth. What is the Ashtaroth? This is a fertility goddess. To earn her favor, the people had to go to the highest place that they could find, a high hill or a high mountain, and perform sexual acts in the form of orgies. And they would go to these high places and have orgies in order to stir the goddess Ashtaroth. She was the fertility goddess. To earn her favor, this is what they did. And I want us to look back in Numbers chapter 33, verse 52. You shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you. This is what the Lord spoke to Moses before the people even entered the promised land. Remember, Moses didn't go into the promised land. So he's giving this command to Moses, saying, I need you to remember this command, and I need you to teach this to the people so that when they enter into the promised land, they know exactly what they are supposed to do. So Moses, I'm giving you this command so you can pass this command on to Joshua and then to the people. I'm giving you this command early so that you can know it. You can hide it in your heart. Here's the command. Moses, tell the people that when they get to the promised land of Canaan, they are going to drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you. They need to destroy all of their figured stones. They need to destroy all their metal images, and they need to demolish, look at this, all their high places. God was very specific when he gave this command. They needed to destroy the figured stones. So all their little gods that they worshiped, all these little figures sitting around their house, they need to get rid of those. They're serving those little gods. They're from the Canaanites. They need to get rid of those. And then they need to destroy all their metal images. Anything that they are worshiping, anything that they are praying to, anything that they are holding up as important, they need to get rid of them. And Moses, don't forget one more thing. I need you to remind them, tell them, command them to demolish. Look at what it says here at the end of verse 52. Demolish all their high places. These high places are where they would have orgies to summon the fertility goddess Ashtaroth. And here's where we see Ashtaroth at the end of verse 13 in Judges chapter 2. God is very specific, and I believe that he's very specific with you and I, with his commands for what we need to get rid of. Verse 14, so the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. Remember what I said, this is years and years and 2 generations of disobedience, 2 generations of idol worship, of child sacrifice, of orgies on the high places, of all kinds of immorality, all kinds of paganism. All of this is happening for generation after generation, and God has withheld his anger until now. Verse 14, so the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the hand of the surrounding enemies so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. Now, right here at this moment, we might want to read this, and we might want to say, well, that's not the kind of God that I want to serve. I don't want to serve a God who just gives me over to plunderers when I do something wrong. I don't want to serve a God who sells me into the hand of my enemies just because I did a few things wrong. Okay, even if you had done just a few things wrong, this isn't what's happening. God is not actually selling you. God is not actually giving you to your enemies. So I want us to look at Job chapter 1, and I think it's going to tie in to what we're reading in Judges about protection. Job chapter 1 verse 9 says this, then Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands and his possessions. They've increased in the land. But, this is Satan talking to God, and he says, but God, if you stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, he will curse you to your face. If you notice what it says in verse 10, a hedge around him. And you might have heard this if you've been in church any length of time, you're going to hear people talk about a hedge of protection. And this is that hedge of protection that we see in Job. But I want to tie it into Judges because this is what's happening here. So Satan is saying to God in the book of Job, God, you have put a hedge of protection around Job. Everything he does prospers. His whole land is increasing because you have put a hedge of protection around him. But God, this is Satan talking, but God, if you stretch out your hand and you remove that hedge of protection, I bet you that Job will curse you to your face because he will no longer be protected. His enemies will be able to attack him. His land will decrease. I bet you his children won't even love him anymore. So God, if you just stretch out your hand and remove your hedge of protection, I bet you he'll curse you to your face. This is what Satan says. Let's go back to Judges and let's read this again and watch kind of what I do here. So God has had his hedge of protection around Israel for generations. Even though within this hedge of protection, they've continued to sin and disobey. But God has held his fingers tight and he has created a hedge of protection for the people. And watch what happens in verse 14. Well, let's read verse 13 actually, so we just get a little bit of context. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. So, watch this. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had sworn. Did you see what happens? God's hedge of protection was around them, but they had disobeyed so long that God said, you know what? You want to serve those other gods? You want to serve all this stuff out here? You want to pursue all this stuff out here? You want to forget that it's me protecting you? You want to forget that it's me that brought you out of Egypt? You want to forget? You want to forget all of that? Okay. And when God stretched out his hands, the hedge of protection was removed. And when that hedge of protection was removed, then there were plunderers who plundered them. Then the surrounding enemies, it was like they were sold to their surrounding enemies. When God's hedge of protection was removed, it says they could no longer withstand their enemies. This is why they felt like they were sold, because their enemies came in and took them and sold them. Their enemies did that. God didn't do that. God was holding them in his hedge of protection. But because of their disobedience, God said, you want all that? You got it. Let's see how you do without my hedge of protection. And how does that apply to us today? We, like the Israelites, want God's hedge of protection, don't we? But we also want all this other stuff out here. And God's saying, just stay in my hedge of protection. Just stay in my arms. Just stay where I can protect you. Because once you go outside of my command, once you disobey, once you rebel, once you resist me and start abandoning me and start serving other gods, you got to stay in here. You got to stay close to me. You got to stay in my presence. This is what's happening to the people. God isn't handing them over. God isn't selling them. God isn't wanting to do any of that. God isn't wanting to cause them distress. God wanted to keep them here, but they disobeyed. And so God stretched out his hand. In the book of Job, God had his hedge of protection around Job because Job feared God and he loved God. And Satan came in and said, hey, God, stretch out your hands and see what happens. And God said, okay. And Job suffered. And Job was in great distress. And there were times in the book of Job that it seems like Job is so angry at God. But at the end, he comes back and he realizes, God, I need that hedge of protection. You can take everything away from me, but as long as I am close to you, you're going to redeem me. Might not be on this earth, but it will be in heaven for sure. It just turns out in the book of Job that God redeemed all of his earthly possessions and his children and all of that stuff as well. But back to Judges. In verse 15 it says, whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them. The hand of the Lord wasn't against them. He wasn't fighting against them. The hand of the Lord was just removed. Because the hand of the Lord was removed, the people could not stand against their enemies. Because if we remember in chapter 1, the Lord gave them victory, but the people had to go with the Lord. So many people want to make God out to be the bad guy. That God's against everyone who does wrong. That God doesn't give any second chances. God only gives second chances. Always. It's like this continual second chance. God was not the bad guy here. We see that, right? But eventually there comes a point where there are a people who are refusing to listen to God's voice. And when that happens, they pushed his hedge of protection so far that he says, you want that so bad. You want it so bad. I'm going to give it to you. You can have it. Run after it. And it pains God to do that. I don't believe for 1 second that God ever wants to remove his hedge of protection. But when there are people who are refusing to obey and they're resisting and they're pushing against that hedge of protection so hard They don't want anything to do with God. They've abandoned God. They don't want to listen anymore. God has no other choice but to stretch out his hands. Now, if they decide to come back to him, of course, he welcomes them back. When I think of a hedge of protection, it also kind of forms a hug. God hugs them. He holds them. God wants to hold us right here, so close to protect us. But when we go outside of his hedge of protection, we're outside of his will for our lives. We're outside of his hug, of him holding us, and we're left to our enemies. We cannot withstand our enemies when we're outside of God's protection.